Wow, that's an interesting question. Well, when it comes to the Congo, the game is played at a much higher level than Peace Corps volunteers. There is Congo is a part of the geostrategic game. Irrespective of how many volunteers are there, during that time, Mobutu was getting the full support of the West. It's getting whatever military equipment he needed, whatever loans that he needed from the World Bank, which he treated as his state coffers as his own personal coffers. In fact, a term was developed just for him and his looting of the Congo. It was called kleptocracy. And that was the kind of state that reigned. So Peace Corps volunteers were inconsequential when you consider the Western nations, multilateral institutions, Western corporations. In fact, you can put all the Peace Corps volunteers you want into one basket and compare them to a gentleman's name is escaping me right now, Jacqueline Onassis's consort, a major donor to the Democratic Party. His name is Jacqueline Onassis's consort. He's a major donor to the Democratic Party. His name, a diamond dealer that's still
Maurice Templeman.
Yes, Maurice Templesman, my own name. Yeah, Maurice Templesman. He was key player in what happened in Zaire, and the Diamond. There's a film out that the PBS had ran a series on called The Diamond Empire, where it deals with the Oppenheimers and the De Beers out of South Africa and Namibia, and then deals with Templesman in Zaire. So the game was just played at a much higher level than volunteers, and that's how Zaire or Congo figures into the politics of the West on that level.
But you think just with that?
Thank you, Coralie Farley, Wilf, D.C. My question is also about Congo. Can you tell me what the role is or status is of AFRICOM in Congo or Rhodesia, that area? Thank you.
Sure. AFRICOM, for those of you who don't know AFRICOM is the Africa Command. And it's a project run out of Stuttgart, Germany, developed by Donald Rumsfeld and George Bush around 2008. And the idea, as you know, the U.S. has different commands throughout the globe. So the idea was to centralize the command around Africa, called the Africa Command. We believe, Africa Command was developed, and it was stated that, well, it was developed to work in concert with the State Department to help build wells, do humanitarian work, basically a benign humanitarian enterprise undertaken by the U.S. military. There was tremendous pushback from African heads of state when AFRICOM was first introduced to the African leaders. I think there was only one head of state who was welcoming AFRICOM and the idea of possibly establishing a base on the African continent, and that was the Liberian leader. I don't know why I'm drawing blank. No, not Charles Taylor. The leader, the lady. Bill, you can help me. Ellen Sirleaf Johnson. She was receptive and open to AFRICOM. But many believe AFRICOM itself is a way for, or one of the ways anyways, for the U.S. to compete against the Chinese presence on the African continent. They cannot compete economically with the Chinese. However, the U.S. can compete militarily. So AFRICOM is seen in that way. that we talk about the militarization of our communities here. Well, AFRICOM is the external component of that, let's say. Just as black communities are being militarized, or in Washington or St. Louis or Baltimore, wherever, well, you have African nations that are being militarized, not only through AFRICOM, but also through special operation forces throughout the continent. Some 40-odd countries during the Obama administration have seen special operation forces on the continent. I don't know, Medea was in here. I don't know if she's still around. But her book that deals with drone warfare, which also touches up on East Africa. So, but to answer your question specifically, yes, there are AFRICOM presence in the Congo, training troops. They're there with not only Congolese, but they're there with the Ugandans. They're there with the Rwandans. Uganda has benefited from millions of dollars in military equipment. When Obama, I think on the very day he got inaugurated, there was a shipment of military equipment to Rwanda from the United States. So the presence is definitely there. And not that you needed AFRICOM to really expand the militarization of the continent, but it definitely is symbolic of that. And people across the board at a grassroots level. Well, if you know if African heads of states are against it, then you know something is up, because they're usually, in bed with the West. If you look at the African Union, for example, its Peace and Security Division, I think almost up to 100% of it is funded by the West. So AFRICOM is something that social justice folks throughout the continent fight against. Folks here started an entity called Resist AFRICOM to confront the U.S. presence on the African continent. Just finally, just to say, to close out, the rationale for developing AFRICOM was to help out humanitarian efforts and all. But when the United States, under the Resolution 1973, and under the principle of responsibility to protect, established the no-fly zones over Libya, it was AFRICOM that was at the lead of those native forces that were dropping bombs on the Libyan population that ultimately resulted in the removal of Gaddafi. Whatever you may think about Gaddafi, the rationale had no basis, or not sufficient enough basis, and it was regime change. And we've seen Libya and Mali and the surrounding countries suffer from that to this day with the proliferation of weapons and all. So we see how AFRICOM has played out, irrespective of what the Defense Department says that it's meant to be. We see what it actually is, and Libya is probably the best example of that.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Other questions? There's one here.
I have two questions. One is about Rwanda, and the other is about the Philippines. Rwanda now has almost 64% women in its parliament, and I'm just curious, what sort of impact would such a high percentage have on a country? I mean, we're struggling with less than 20%. We're 97th in the world. So how effective have women been in that parliament? My question for the Philippines is, during the Vietnam War, there were thousands of women who were forced in prostitution, and the Philippines finally asked the U.S. to remove their bases. What's happening now? It seems like we're back to being building bases in the Philippines. How did that come about?
Okay. Thank you for the question regarding Rwanda. In a normal democracy, it would be laudable to have 64% or whatever percentages of women. However, if you look at Rwanda, it's not Rwanda is a dictatorship. It's an authoritarian regime, and it's controlled by Paul Kagame. Irrespective of the glowing remarks or the accolades it gets around women or economic development, it is a police state. And there's several examples, but probably the example that you can relate to best, there are 2 elections held in Rwanda since the genocide. And the first election, Paul Kagame won with 95% of the votes. The second election won with 93% of the votes. Now, I don't have 95% agreement in my own family, right? Much less a state. So the opposition, they were beheaded, driven out of the country, media was muzzled. If you look at any, Human Rights Watch has documented this quite well. The United Nations, they have what they call a group of experts. They've documented this quite well as well. So in a state like that, it's kind of hard to get past the authoritarian, dictatorial leader in Paul Kagame to get to the question of women, because everything that happens there that he controls. And that it's important to remember that when looking at Rwanda, that the freedom is very limited, whether it's for women, for the press, opposition figures. And we just have to keep a close eye on it. What Kagame has been expert at doing, and he's done it very well, is to leverage the genocide to his advantage. And insight into Kagame is to look at the friends that he keeps and where he goes, right? So he has folks like Sheldon Adelson as his friend. Those of you who know him, he's a major funder of Newt Gingrich, right? Tony Blair, stellar record in Iraq, right? He's one of the key supporters of Paul Kagame. I mentioned in my presentation about the Spanish courts and universal jurisdiction. One of the individuals that was on that arrest list had gone to England, and he was arrested by the British government because of the arrest warrant that was out on him based on for the Spanish courts. And who stepped up to defend him, to serve as his attorney? None other than Tony Blair's wife. Also, key supporter of Paul Kagame is Bill Clinton. So he has very powerful friends, and he presents an image to the world that he's the savior of the Rwandan people, and he's created a miracle in Rwanda. But if you look at dissidents who have been assassinated, MI6 had warned Rwandans in Britain that Paul Kagame had put out a hit on some of the individuals that were in dissent, against his government. South Africa fell out. They had a diplomatic role. South Africa had to send back Rwandan diplomats because of assassinations that Rwanda, Paul Kagame had committed in South Africa. So that's the picture, irrespective of some of the, the decorations that he has that would make us feel warm and fuzzy and say, hey, this is a good guy.
Thank you.
In terms of the question of the Philippines, the struggle against the bases was a very protracted struggle that was a component of the whole national democratic movement within the Philippines against the Marcos regime. And the defeat of the Marcos regime in many ways was representative of a nationalist assertion by masses of people there that included that they wanted the end of U.S. military bases. The U.S. has been able to reinsert itself in the Philippines, as it has in a number of other places, through the post 9/11 atmosphere. So the U.S. supported the various Philippine governments in their counterinsurgency work against, most importantly, the Communist Party of the Philippines and the New People's Army, but also the various Moro insurrections in Mindanao, including the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. The Philippine government, or I should say the Philippine military, did something very interesting. They basically created a monster called Abu Sayyaf. And the U.S. media treated Abu Sayyaf as an outgrowth of Al-Qaeda. It's better understood as something that was created by the Philippine military. And it was created in some ways in order to have a monster that would justify the further militarization of the Philippines. And so Abu Sayyaf and these various kidnappings, all of which have been very serious. I mean, we're not talking about games, but we're talking about the creation of a criminal organization, has led to a justification for the reintroduction of U.S. military involvement. And it's been getting very serious. Now, the question is, what is going to happen now with Duterte as the president? And I'd say all bets are off. I mean, this is very unpredictable. He asserts himself as a nationalist. He has begun renegotiations with the National Democratic Front, which the Communist Party of the Philippines is a leadership of. It's sending very different signals than prior administrations. But that's essentially how the U.S. became a new player, or a renewed player in the Philippines.
Thank you. Before we ask more questions, we do have time for a few more, but I see people are starting to leave a little bit, so I want to make a couple of announcements. One, to remind everyone that the conference and live stream will begin tomorrow at 9 a.m. There are 9 panels with some really great speakers. We have David Hartsoe, Dennis Kucinich, John Deere, Medea Benjamin, and several others. Check the website for more information. Volunteers will be here at 8:30. Also, after the end of the day, there's some trays of that vegetable dish left over. So if anyone wants to bring a tray home, you're welcome to do so. Okay. Other questions? I see back and then here and here.
Yeah. Hey, I'm Michael McPherson. I'm the Executive Director of Veterans for Peace. I'm also one of the few black people that's been in leadership in the peace movement for quite some time. So I really wanted to thank the panel for what you brought to us today. I particularly wanted to thank the young lady for being so blunt about the state of the peace movement when it comes to looking at racism and other issues. So that's nice you clap, but I hope you're listening to what she's saying, because I've been saying it for quite some time, and we just need more voices to say it in this room. Since I've been part of the peace movement to today has been this white, maybe not this room, but rooms I've been in. So if we're going to be successful, we really do have to change that. Building solidarity is real quick. I'm not trying to make a long statement, but I just need to say this. Building solidarity for what I've called a full spectrum movement, which is the possibility is here right now, but you're going to have to change how you see and look at things. So one thing Veterans for Peace has done is have a framing called Peace at Home, Peace Abroad, because you can't have one without the other. And when I go and talk about peace at home, peace abroad, people get that. So I'm not saying you have to use the term peace at home, peace abroad, but you have to think about things, I believe, in that way. And another thing we've done is we have Veterans Challenge Islamophobia. That's a campaign that we launched some months ago, and we're going to continue. So we're starting to understand and move forward in that direction. But I'm going to tell you that I got a lot of pushback in my organization. Veterans for Peace is in St. Louis, Missouri, so when Ferguson kicked off, I had no choice to be involved in it. I mean, one thing, I'm black, but also every progressive organization was involved, and I got a lot of pushback over that. It was very disappointing. It hurt my heart that had to happen. So everything she said is very true, and we're going to have to change how, I should say you all have to change, because I got it already. Going to have to change how you see and how you do the work. See the connections, uncover the connections. You don't have to make them because they're there. And we can really make the changes we need to make. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, there was a question. Oh, this gentleman then. Okay, this gentleman next.
Alan Haber, Darakshan, Raja, thank you very much, and Bill, Brother Bill. What you both put forward is a view that how almost all white Americans see America is all confused. How do you really see a movement transforming the way the ordinary American, European-based citizen sees the origin and corruption or misunderstanding of this country in a way that is toward a reconciliation or a compassion or a sense of living together, or we are one human family? Yeah, this is an agony. You lay it out so clear, and yet the ordinary person is so challenged they can't even. My neighbors down the street, this is really tough to deal with, and yet that's exactly what we're up against. So maybe a couple more reflections on how just to talk to the ordinary, non-dark-skinned, not, basic European America. This is the greatest country in the world. We are all honorable people, et cetera, et cetera. Give us just a bit more, because this is tough stuff.
I have to be honest, I think ever since coming to the Washington Peace Center and engaging a lot of white folks, it's very challenging because it's hard where to begin. And I think that task of actually dealing and educating other white folks can only be done by white people, because in many instances, if I stand up already because of the identities that I occupy, I'm not seen as a credible person speaking. We know that the language of things such as objectivity, so many times people will use respectability in this way of you're just being an angry woman or you're so emotional. Not that the issues that we're dealing with are so violent that if you're not emotional and you're not upset, something is wrong with you. So let's be real about that. But I think it's hard work, and I do fully believe that if we really are talking about getting beyond racism and building an equitable society, then the way that whiteness exists has to be dismantled. I just don't see any other way around it, because the ways in which the hierarchy of race in America, and I think even globally, is able to sustain itself is that there is this white nationalism. There is this white tribalism that people automatically identify with. And so I think the white folks have to really get together and think about what other identities do you hold? I mean, when race was constructed and whiteness was constructed, it was in part created so that low-income folks would not build solidarity with black African slaves, right? That's where it comes from. And so then the solution, I think, is very much also the destruction of whiteness as it is. And I think that's a very difficult conversation to have with white people, because it's not to say the destruction of white people. It's to say that construct of race, of what whiteness represents as being hierarchical, as being the status of what liberation, of civilization, of democracy, of everything good, that is the beacon of it, has to completely change. And as long as that doesn't happen, I think what we're just going to get is some reform, some progressive stuff, but it's not going to really hit the core of what we need to do, which is really the power. Folks who have the power are going to have to give that up in some ways and then share it and think about what does that look like as an equitable society. But beyond that, I frankly don't see any other solution.
Thank you. There's a question here.
Can I just throw something in? Just about that question?
Oh, yes.
I'd give a slightly different answer. I think at the level of winning people over, you have to think about it as an organizing project, not a proselytizing project. And so it begins with concentrating first on the people who are the most receptive, not the people the most hostile. There's absolutely no point in having a discussion with ardent Trump supporters right now. There isn't. And this is not a moral judgment. This is a cold, organizing judgment. And so you build out. And part of that discussion is about history. I've been saying this time and again. In the United States, we oppose history. We actively oppose history. We embrace myth. And so the problem is that in the United States, when you oppose history, what happens? You get this ridiculous approach that I call from now on. And from now on, you hear it time and again. It is, I may have killed your family, but from now on, I assure you that I will not do that. I may have stolen your land, but from now on, I guarantee you I will not do that. So it basically says we should ignore the past. We should ignore history. We should ignore the question of repairing damage and instead take everything at face value that we're on an equal playing field, that everything is cool, that we're great people, and that from now on we'll be better human beings. We've got to dispel. Absolutely, this needs to be dispelled. So that means engaging discussions about history. My feeling is that, my experience is that loads of people, particularly working class people, are thirsty for real history. What is the real history of the United States? And sometimes it's very scary, but it's nevertheless something where the lights go on. So that's one point. The second thing, this is not about, in my opinion, which identity people choose. It is understanding that race is a system of oppression and social control that is intricately linked with capitalism. So trying to withdraw race and assume that you will have a nice capitalist system is like trying to take my lungs away and say, Bill, keep breathing, right? It is simply not going to happen. The two things are integral. So it means that in order to really confront race, you've got to understand its relationship to capitalism. That in the 1600s, as I was starting to say in my initial talk, it was the recognition by the colonial elite that they had real problems at the base among European and African indentured servants who were constantly revolting, that they could not figure out how to unite these against the Native Americans. It's in that context that race is constructed, borrowing from what the British implemented in Ireland, what came to be known as anti-Irish racism. And so I think that when we're talking about what to do, it's along those lines. The final point is this. We have no choice but to succeed, because if we do not, we're looking at a dystopia. Every time we see Trump and everything that he represents, it is a revolt against the future. It is an attempt to take us back into a very, very dark period.
Thank you. Okay. In the green, and then.
Yeah, in listening to the comments about how the peace movement is too white, etc., I was thinking that nobody has commented, and even in the earlier panel, about the women leaders and gender. There's a flip side to this, which I call identity politics, and that we see people like Madeleine Albright and Hillary Clinton and Condi Rice and Susan Rice and Colin Powell, and so lots of people are seeing those faces. I mean, maybe we don't see them in the peace movement, but the war movement is seeing this, and I think that is very powerful for people, thinking that Condi Rice says we can torture, and she's a black female, and etc. So I think there's another side to this that hasn't been commented on.
Sure. I'm happy you brought that up, because I was going to throw in patriarchy as well with racism and capitalism. So I'll also add that in terms of from where I sit, in terms of movements on the ground, it is women who are leading them. So not just when we talk about Hillary Clinton or the ways in which a white supremacist patriarchal system will put these token women in front of us and say, well, now it must be much more just the kind of policies that we're having, that is very much manipulating identity politics. But that doesn't mean that the system in itself is actually about gender justice. Because if you look at Clinton's policies, if you look at what Condi Rice did and all of them, their policies were very much patriarchal. I mean, the impact of turning around war is felt by the margins of our communities, which women are part of. And the resistance as well to all of these wars, to anti-blackness in this country, I mean, the leaders all across the board are women of color, are trans folks, are queer folks. And I think that that's a shift in the ways in which liberation struggles right now. We're seeing leadership emerge in a new way, that it has said and called in the patriarchy of the movements themselves, that too often we centered men at the middle and forgot about many of the women, the queer folks who were organizing and experienced mass violence. But now that is switching. And right now, again, the front line of who I see out there are actually women, trans folks, queer folks, and they're calling in patriarchy and they're calling in capitalism. But thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, thank you. We have the gentleman here and then a question here. So here and here.
I just wanted to bring up something that I experienced when I was a substitute teacher at Wilson High School. And this is about teaching against racism or prejudice. So they divided, Wilson, of course, is integrated, so they divided up different students for their ethnical backgrounds, and they said, now don't be shy, you know, like some questions were, when you think of this group over here, what's the first thing that comes into your mind? What's the stereotype? What's this and that and the other? And then they had us teachers. And, of course, the teachers are held back in what they really came up with. But the students came out with all these insulting things or stereotypes and images. And then they asked then you had to ask the other group, well, how does that make you feel? But what happened was there was an exchange of misconceptions and so on to put people on an equal playing field. And one thing that was discovered was, if you want people to change their attitudes, don't shame them. Try to reach out to them. And it's a matter of enlightenment, because your life is so, the joy of your life is so increased when you understand other people and appreciate them, and you're not afraid of them, and you don't think they hate you because of who you are. So anyway, kids I think people come a long way. I know a lot of people may not agree with it, but I think people have come a long way in this country. And you look around the world, there's more awareness about torture and so on. We've got to try and reach out to each other. I don't know, it sounds too sentimental, but we have to reach out to each other. We're all in this terrible predicament. We're in a man-made apocalypse. So we've got to help each other and transcend this terrible burden of history.
Thank you. Okay, question here.
My question is mainly for Darakshan about FBI entrapment of Muslims and how that plays into continues to play into the repression of Muslims and the messaging that gets out to most of them, through the corporate media.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you mentioned that, because I work with an organization, actually I would ask all you to follow. It's called National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms. It particularly works with Muslim families whose individuals have been basically entrapped in terrorist cases, and also have been part of the preemptive prosecutions that have happened domestically under the War on Terror. So I believe, according to the data, it's that more than 70% of the cases the FBI says are actually terrorists are actually manufactured. So they're entrapped. They're surveilled. I've been in rooms with mothers who've talked about their sons being entrapped by the FBI and the ways in which who they go after. They're going after folks with mental illnesses. They're going after folks who are basically anything that you say can be used against you. And I think that it's been in some ways a very real message to the Muslim community that we don't have safe spaces that we can be in. So, for example, just earlier this week, I held a healing circle only for Muslims, and we have a suspicion that there was an informant in the room. Again, can't even have a healing space without that. There have been stories now as well of particularly one individual I can think of whose son was actually entrapped after he was arrested and put in Rikers Island. So they sent an informant while he was actually arrested on quote-unquote technical things like not paying tickets, other things that we know. And then also they've sent particularly people, this is the ways in which intersectionality happens, where black folks who have been brought into into the criminal justice system are having these deals where they're like, look, do you want to be on the FBI sort of roster to go out there and entrap these folks? And who they target, again, are people who are low income, poor, African-American Muslims, immigrants, and so forth. And because of the ways in which I'd say the hierarchy in the Muslim community works, which is very much predominantly middle class, upper middle class Arabs and South Asians, the response has been sort of, we are good Muslims. We are doctors, we're engineers, we're lawyers. And what that has done is it has actually isolated the people in our community who get incarcerated, because to even be in a room and say, this is a family member that is actually convicted of terrorism charges, without questioning what that conviction looks like, without questioning, was that actually a physical crime or was this thought crimes? I mean, there's no question, right? Automatically you say the word terrorist and people are like, okay, 9/11, that's it, boom, we don't really care. And so it's been a real way of destroying community. It's been in a way of destroying also our leadership. One individual I can think of who founded this organization called NCPCF, Dr. Sami Al-Arian, was a huge political figure in the Muslim American community, had meetings pre-9/11 with George Bush, by the way. And so that's who we're talking about. And then he was picked up and quote unquote in supporting terrorism abroad. We know that people doing any aid, quote unquote, in Palestine or other parts of the world is seen as the material support for terrorism. So those charges have really come out of the Muslim community. And I think that they're so broad that for all of us, we worry that anything I even said over here today, some FBI person can say that is material support for terrorism, or this is person who has proclivity to be an extremist and so forth. So it's a real fear that we all have about being prosecuted, being targeted, and I'll say that it is within the federal system, right? So we're not talking about the local, your local policing, you're talking about federal FBI, and the prisoners that you get have actually been put in what are called CMUs, which are now called Gitmo North. So it's basically taking Guantanamo Bay style incarceration, putting them into federal prison facilities where the majority, more than 70% of these communication management units, which is 23 hours of solitary confinement, it's prison within a prison, are actually Muslims.
I just want to comment briefly about, I live in Canada, and about a year ago, a friend of mine was Muslim. He and his wife are both university professors, dual citizens, U.S. and Canada. He's from Palestine, she's Kashmiri. And the Canadian Security Intelligence Service called him for an interview because they had gotten an anonymous call that he was affiliated with some terrorist group or was doing something terrorist. So he asked me to attend with him and his wife, which I did. And the gentleman was just so cheerful and had nothing at all except some anonymous. He couldn't say what it was, where it came from, or anything else. But it was just harassment of a prominent Muslim. We have time for, I think maybe we can go as long as we want to, but we have time for some more questions. There's one in the back, and then another one. Okay, here, and then behind you.
Okay, I know we're running out of time, but I've been waiting for this panel all day, so I'm going to be a little selfish. I just want to thank you all for being on this panel today. It's been really important, especially for me in being here. My question is to Bill Fletcher. I remember a few years ago you talked about history today, and I remember a few years ago you sat us down. I was with Dream Defenders at the time and talked to us about the history of the freedom movement and sort of like the generational divide in that like we don't have access to a lot of that history. And I think it's pretty much the same way when we talk about the Black radical tradition and our history with peace movements and anti-war movements. So I'm wondering, like, with this emergence of, the struggle for Black freedom and liberation inside the United States, how can our movement incorporate the history and the importance of peace movements and the anti-war movements today as we struggle within the United States?
Well, thank you, first of all. One of the things that if you look at our movement, by our I mean the African American movement, one of the things that you see repeatedly is these historical breaks. And so I came up in the 60s and early 70s. And I remember after the advent of emergence of Black Power, and I would see these red, black, and green flags. And I was so proud of my generation for coming up with red, black, and green flags. And I just said, this is absolutely phenomenal. This is right. And I had no idea that this came out of Marcus Garvey. I thought it was our creation. I had no idea about the work of communists in the 1930s in the South and their role in helping to build tremendous mass organizations, unionization, things like that. So one of the things that I really emphasize, and I'm saying this to many of my friends in the movement for Black Lives, is that you've got to study. You need to institutionalize study. And study is not 140 characters. And I, was that subtle enough, right? It is not 140 characters, nor is it a posting on Facebook, nor is it relying on Wikipedia, right? It really is getting into and it's doing a couple of different things. It's actually accessing various kinds of materials that are out there. But in addition to that, we have to translate a lot of this into language that regular people can understand. There are very well-intentioned Black academics who write in Amharic. And it is just simply impossible to understand what it is that they're writing, and all of these different terms and the way it's phrased, and right? And so part of the job, I would argue, for Black radicals is to not only identify this material, but to translate it into ways that regular people can understand. We need to reestablish study groups and discussion groups in every organization that we're participating in. Because, see, the part of the breaks that I'm talking about is it's not like laziness. There's active repression that takes place that creates a cleavage between movements. And so the movement that I emerged out of, much of that history was lost as a result of things like COINTELPRO. The imprisonment, the murder, driving it crazy, driving into exile activists. Also, something else, and I'm not saying there's a conspiracy here, but books that just simply are no longer published. They're just not available. Articles that are out there. So I think that it's really critical that we reintroduce a culture of active learning and questioning within the movement. And unfortunately, what I see is a lot of, let me put it like this. It goes back to what I said about how we oppose history in the United States. We also don't like to think in the United States. There's really, the anti-intellectualism is very strong even in progressive circles, where we sometimes ridicule people for theorizing, right? And we have to break from that and really encourage an atmosphere where people think, where we can debate, where debate doesn't necessarily result in condemning somebody immediately for an opposing view. So I'd say all of those things are part of the kind of transforming our movement or movements. And when you talk about peace, what's really, one of the things that's interesting is that many activists of color identify the peace movement with white people, right? And we don't look at and recognize the various contributions that have been made by people of color to anti-war movements, right? To whether it was, like, for example, the Vietnam War, right? The mainstream media presents the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement as a white thing, right? You would think that people of color were passive observers. How many people know about or remember the Chicano moratorium of August 29th, 1970, right? And what that represented. How many people understand what was going on when SNCC and King took a stand against the war, right? All of that type of history ends up getting whited out, forgive the pun. It gets completely whited out, And many of our own activists within our movements then come up thinking, well, this anti-war stuff, that's for white folks. No, danger, Will Robinson. No, it is part of us. It is something that we help to construct. And so I think that, well, it's a long answer. I'm sorry. But hopefully I responded to your point.
Thank you.
Okay, there was, no, okay. I think one.
I just want to say the Black Revolutionary Reader is available for free download from the Black Studies Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. It has all the original powerful articles going back, 150 years. Right, Bill?
Yes.
The Black Revolutionary Reader?
There's plenty of material that's actually out there.
Yeah.
But again, there's a certain level of laziness. There's a certain.
I only came across it because black students taught me.
That's right.
That it was available.
There's a lot
and
out
also
of the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana.
Right.
That's another site. So.
And the anti-war movement learned everything we knew from the civil rights movement.
Okay, it's 8 o'clock, so I think people are probably ready to wind up. I thank the panel very much. It's been a very informative session.
Oh, just let me say, if you want the film from tonight, you can get it out at the desk there. We encourage you to screen it in your communities and share it with your network. So thank you.
We'll see you all tomorrow morning at 9.